Hello, so I'd like to give you some general feedback on your mind map before I get started. So I want you to look at the colors that you chose here for your mind map. This very pale yellow background with white font over it makes it very difficult to read what's in the yellow boxes versus the contrast that you see here in the lavender with the black writing, right? So just be aware of that. If you're going to have this yellow background, a darker font would be better for your readers, right? And probably better visually for anyone that was looking at this particular mind map. So female Foley catheter insertion for undergrad nursing students in the sim lab is a good central topic for this. So let's talk about your theories that you chose and the theorist, and we'll break it down. So information processing theory is actually not a theory of just Miller. There are other theorists that focus predominantly on information processing theory to bring it actually into the now, if you will. So Miller created this theory very early on, and since that time, that theory of information processing has been pushed forward by Atkinson and Sherfin in 1968, Bradsford, and then most recently, Remmelhart and McClellan in 1986. So if you're going to look at a theory that's being expanded upon and built upon to bring it into the current time, you would need to acknowledge those theorists as well, because the way that we use this theory, the way we utilize this theory and in current practice would definitely be affected, would be influenced by those theorists that have brought that theory up to more modern times. Okay, so in the view of knowledge for information processing, remember information processing is one of the cognitivist theories, so it's computer-like. In my mind, that's how I define it, computer-like. But it's all based on process, right? And you've discussed process in the view of knowledge. Learning is an adjustment in their level of knowledge, but again, it's about processing and storing and how that stored memory is accessed, again, kind of like a computer. The role of the student, right, is to optimize those strategies for storage and retrieval, right? So storage and retrieval is very important, right, for knowledge in this particular theory. And students, from the educator's role, students should be given educational environments or should work in educational environments that are most supportive of that storage and memorization processing type of environment, right? So ways in which that information can be extracted and then integrated, right, into the mind. Sort of like central processing unit of a computer. So here you have some ways that this theory can inform your instruction. And you're saying allow them to create their own written list of Foley insertion steps, which would show you their process, right? But then what would you do with that, right? And then you'd have them verbally relay the steps. Well, maybe not. If the students aren't sure of the steps at that point, would you have them verbally relay what they've written, or would you have them get feedback on what they've written or give feedback to one another and then talk about the steps, right, and that kind of thing. So you need to think about this a little bit, about the instruction part. Okay, so andragogy is an adult learning theory, and that is Knowles, right? So the adult learning theory would be out here as the broader theory, and then andragogy is one of those theories, and then Malcolm Knowles is the theorist that we align with andragogy. And adults want to be autonomous, right? And that's how we view the knowledge, and they want to retain, they want to work toward it. The view of learning is that adults want to know why, right? And not only why, but how that information is going to be utilized practically, right? Practical utilization of information and knowledge, right? Kind of like what we're digging into now. What's the practical information from these theories, right? What can I do? How can I use it? Why do I need to know this, right? Student has to be self-aware and self-determined and focused on integrating and learning that information, and you as the educator work as a facilitator in an andragogious classroom, where that is the predominant theory. So how are you going to integrate this into catheter insertion? Right? And you're talking about case studies and scenarios, right? And let them do a self-evaluation, simulation, and maybe use of role play, right? To get them to understand how they're going to use this particular skill set. Social learning theory is Bandura, right? Bandura talks about self-efficacy in social learning. So self-efficacy has to be mentioned here in the description of the view of knowledge and in the view of learning, right? That self-efficacy will drive that predetermined social aspect, right? Why a student wants to learn in that particular social context is often based on, in Bandura's stance, is always based on their self-efficacy. Do they think they can? Do they believe they can actually do this, right? So self-efficacy has to be mentioned if you're talking about social learning theory, right? And Bandura. Okay, so we have repair theory, and that's Van Len, right? And repair theory is very interesting because it talks about, if you read any of his work, and actually the work that he did in the 1980s was done with another researcher, and I believe his name was Brown, but don't quote me on that. But I actually just pulled up their paper the other day, but his name is escaping me because we usually think of Kurt being the one who's tied to the repair theory. They talk about bugs in the system, and how when students process, they find bugs in the system. And when they're trying to manipulate those bugs, or repairing, you're saying their errors, is where they find true learning. So it's more or less that scientific method of try and fail, right? And then use those errors, right, those mistakes, in order to learn from those mistakes. So as educators, we need to provide them with an educational environment where students who are risk averse can start to take on risks, right? Because it's felt that from repair theory that making those mistakes is what's going to teach us, right? That's how students will learn. So as an educator role, you need to provide that environment where mistakes are expected to happen and where growth is expected to happen from those mistakes, right? In a growth mindset, if you're talking about DWEC, right? So that it's okay to make a mistake, right? Step-by-step instructions are important, but giving those step-by-step instructions sometimes will force students into thinking that they have to be right? So you want to make it very clear when you're in this environment, if you're going to be using repair theory, that you are allowing space in that environment for error, right? Because error is expected. In fact, error is applauded. Error is built into the system so that when they make a mistake, when there is an error, they know to correct it and how to correct it and why they're correcting it, right? So think about that. All right. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me.